Mr. President, the explanatory statement for this proposal says its objectives are secure, affordable and sustainable energy. Yet for many years the EU has followed policies which have exactly the opposite effect. Germany, with the largest renewables investment, now uses increasing volumes of lignite. In the UK, we are planning to use diesel generation as backup. The highly respected Economist magazine runs a front-page story, Clean Energy's Dirty Secret. I recommend it to colleagues. It says we have created regulatory and subsidy structures that militate against energy infrastructure investment and threaten security of supply. I quote, "Green energy is eating its own tail." Yet this proposal today amounts to little more than bureaucratic paper pushing. The explanatory note concludes, the EU is torn apart by migratory and Eurozone crises. It desperately needs a success. Indeed it does, Mr. President, but this report will not deliver that success.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was my opportunity to take you right into the European Parliament. That was last Wednesday night. You may have noticed, if you were following very closely right at the beginning, that there seemed to be very few people in the chamber. Now that is largely because it was actually 10:30 at night. And the other thing you need to understand about the European Parliament is that you don't have real debate where people really change opinions by arguing their case. No, what you have, because of course it's all web streamed, what you have is the opportunity for members of the Parliament to create nicely packaged 60-second commercials that can go out on social media. But that was the speech that I gave on Wednesday. Now, ever since we won that referendum back in June, I've had people saying to me, well, UKIP exists in order to achieve Brexit. You've achieved Brexit. What are you going to do now? What is the purpose of the party? Well, I think it's very obvious what the purpose of the party is, and the immediate purpose, of course, is to make sure that Brexit is delivered rather than merely voted for. But the fact is that we do have radical policies in a wide range of areas, and it's my job in a few minutes this morning to convince you that we have radical and viable policies in the area of energy. Now, we just had Neil Hamilton telling us about Wales and telling us about the proportion of Welsh households who are in fuel poverty. And obviously a major contributor to fuel poverty is, guess what? The price of fuel. And why is energy expensive? It is as a deliberate act of policy, a whole series of measures that have been put in place by Brussels, but also carried through with enthusiasm by successive British governments, have had the effect of increasing the cost of energy. Now, of course, politicians are very good at deflecting blame. And what the government would like you to believe is that it's the wicked, profiteering energy companies who are at fault for increasing energy prices, and all you as energy users need to do is shop around and change your supplier every 6 months, and that will drive down costs. No, it won't, when we actually have deliberate policies in place designed to increase prices. One of the things that I have spent a lot of time on in the European Parliament is the emissions trading scheme, which is absolutely clear and deliberately trying to raise energy prices. Like so many European policies, thank God it is failing abysmally. The idea was to put a price of 30 or 40 euros per tonne on emissions of CO2. I think the last time I checked it was running about 8 euros a tonne. They can't even put together an emissions trading scheme, but it is a deliberate policy, not just the emissions trading scheme, but a whole range of schemes designed to squeeze out the evils of CO2 emissions. So how are they getting on with this policy? Well, they will tell you they're doing very well. Europe now accounts for only about 11% of global CO2 emissions, only 11%. What they don't tell you, of course, is that the effect, I've said this many times, but it bears repeating, the effect of high energy prices on households, but especially on businesses, is that whole industries, energy-intensive industries, are driven overseas. Industries like steel, we all know the problems the steel industry has had, aluminium, chemicals, fertilizers, petrochemical refining, glass, all these industries are being driven overseas either by factories actually moving or by new investment going outside Europe. If you look not just at the emissions in the European Union, which as I say 11 or 12%, if you add in the CO2 emissions from all the imports, for example of Chinese steel, but all the other products that we import into Europe, Europe is actually responsible for something like 25% of emissions. So they have a policy which has driven up energy costs in Europe, has forced households into fuel poverty, has forced energy-intensive businesses to move elsewhere, but actually is not reducing global emissions of CO2 at all, and is arguably increasing them, because a ton of steel, I am told a ton of steel made in Shanghai produces about twice as much CO2 as a ton of steel made in more modern and efficient equipment in Europe. So they are failing in the very objective they set themselves. But what does it do to European competitiveness? The rest of the world actually is achieving cheap energy or lower cost energy. In America, they've actually done much better reducing emissions than we've done in Europe. Have they done it by elaborate green energy schemes? No, they haven't. What they've done is they've done a transition from coal to gas, because gas is cheaper, and as you probably know, for the same amount of energy, gas produces about half the amount of CO2. So Europe is in global competition with America, but has very much higher energy prices. Europe is also in global competition with places like China and India. Now they are building coal-fired power stations, and coal is relatively cheap. Lots of people, especially in the green movement, will say, well, look at China, they're spending a fortune on green energy. Well, they are spending a lot of money on green energy, but I tell you, they are spending a great deal more on new coal-fired power stations. They are, of course, very concerned about the pollution problems they have in major cities, and a lot of the new power stations are going well away from the cities for that very reason. But we have a Europe which is becoming hopelessly uncompetitive simply because you've got America and China and India, all of them with very competitively priced energy, while Europe has very high energy costs. Now, I've been arguing this case for a long time, and I felt sometimes to be a bit of a lonely voice. If you go back to 2008, when the Westminster Parliament passed that Climate Change Act, which has done so much damage, probably the most expensive peacetime piece of legislation in the history of our country, I think there were just 5 MPs who voted against it. So this attitude about green energy is absolutely embedded. And having been a lone voice for a long time, I don't mind being a lone voice, I'm used to it, especially when I believe I'm right, but it was very, very encouraging to have that vindication, and you saw the magazine which I held up in the European Parliament, and I love that headline, Clean Energy's Dirty Secret. I'd love to give you just a couple of quotes from it, if I may. Ernst & Young estimates that utilities across Europe wrote off 120 billion euros, that's billion with a B, not million with an M, of assets between 2010 and 2015 because of lower prices. Some chap called Rolando Fuentes, isn't that a lovely name, of CAPSARC, an energy think tank in Saudi Arabia, claims the world is caught in a vicious circle, renewables suppress power prices, increasing the need for financial support. An Australian industry expert says his country faces, quote, an incipient utility death spiral. And the one I really love best, and the one that, as you saw, I used in the speech, Francis O'Sullivan of MIT says, solar cannibalizes its own competitiveness away, it eats its own tail. Now, you may notice a discrepancy here. I've spent the last, 5 years arguing that renewables are too expensive, and yet The Economist is saying that renewables bring prices down. How can that be? I'll tell you how it is. The way renewables work is it costs a huge amount of money to put up your wind farms and your solar arrays and all those things. There is a massive upfront investment, which almost everywhere is being covered by the taxpayer because of subsidies. And another figure, I'll quote you from the Economist piece, they reckon in the last 10 years, globally, $800 billion, again with a B, $800 billion have been used as subsidies to generate green energy. Once you've spent that massive upfront amount of money, however, the juice that comes out afterwards has a very low marginal cost. And the way the grid is structured, the grid is always instructed to take the lowest marginal cost available at the time. So obviously when the wind is blowing, that's the place to get it. That means that your coal-fired power stations and your gas-fired power stations are actually not operating at that time. The effect of that is that nobody is prepared to invest in gas-fired power stations, for example, because you can't make money out of it. And the result is that we in Britain are facing a crisis because we haven't got enough capacity. Now you may say, well, you've got all this new supply on and off intermittently from green energy, and we've got the capacity we had previously, so surely we're going to be okay. No, we're not, and I'll tell you why we're not. First of all, because our nuclear power stations are approaching the end of their useful life and are being closed down, and you know how slow we are in putting up new nuclear power stations. But secondly, our coal-fired power stations, perfectly good coal-fired power stations, are being closed down because of the European Union's large combustion plant directive. They have told us to do it. So what I have to say now is very simple, is thank heavens we are getting out and in the process of getting out now, because the damage which European policy is doing to energy and energy prices and families and industrial competitiveness is enormous. Is really, really serious. What's all this driven by? Of course, it's driven by climate alarmism, as we know. And having been, as I said earlier, pretty much a lone voice, and UKIP's position is on this is, like our position on so many things, is a radical position. I tell you what, it was an absolute tonic to see what is going on in America. I've known a guy called Myron Ebell, who's been around the climate skeptic debate for many years in think tanks and so on, and I was astonished and delighted when in the States we had Donald Trump appoint Myron Ebell, this very man that I've known for a long time, to head up his transition team for the EPA, the Environment Protection Agency. Absolutely marvellous news, and in fact Myron was across in Brussels in February. We had dinner together, we talked about it, and it was almost unbelievable. Suddenly, the largest economy in the world and the most powerful man in the world is effectively endorsing the attitude that we have taken to energy. Trump is determined to regenerate American industry based on low-cost energy, and he knows how to do it, and I believe it will happen. And of course, he's appointed Scott Pruitt to head up the EPA now, who will carry through policies of that kind. The other thing is, and I think Bill over there will be pretty excited about this, Donald Trump is diverting funds from various government agencies, and especially from the EPA, into the military. And again, I think that much of the approach that Bill is quite rightly taking to the defence question is very much in line with what our friends and colleagues in America are also doing. So these decisions that are being made in America are obviously good for America. They will increase American competitiveness, and they will be very helpful both to industries and to households in America. But they are very, very bad news for Europe, because Europe is determined to go on with the policies that it has already had. Its competitiveness position will get worse and worse compared to America and compared to other major industrial areas like China. In one sense, we can rejoice that we are getting out just in time. But this creates the challenge, and this is one of the things that UKIP needs to focus on as we go forward. That, as I said, in Britain, only 5 MPs in Westminster voted against the Climate Change Act, which is even more extreme than some of the policies coming out of Brussels. It's not good enough just to get out of the European Union. What we also have to do is in Westminster to promote and back and adopt appropriate policies to deliver secure and affordable energy. That is the next task. Getting out of the EU was a necessary condition. It is not a sufficient condition. We still have a job to do. UKIP still has a job to do in this area, as in so many areas, to generate rational policies that can ensure the success of a post-Brexit Britain. So that is the challenge for UKIP and for our country, is to adopt rational policies in the wake of Brexit, and I hope we're going to do that. Thank you very much indeed.